Well, good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here in Orlando, particularly having left the kind of cold northeast of the United States. John, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thanks to each of you for being here and for your interest in science and technology and how we apply that to enhance the capabilities of the American soldier. What I'd like to do this morning, I'm going to talk just a minute about what TRADOC does for a living. I'm going to talk a little bit about the operational environment which our soldiers find themselves in today, and then I'm going to talk, I hope at some length, about science and technology and how we can empower those individual soldiers inside that operational environment. If I could have the first slide, please. And this is, I guess, is the obligatory Chamber of Commerce slide, if you will. It talks a little bit about training and doctrine command, and I won't belabor the point other than to say that in TRADOC we have a homely little saying that says victory starts here, and it does. It starts in our training centers, in our classrooms. It starts in the minds of some of the great individuals that work in training and doctrine command, and they think about the future, because you see TRADOC has two very important responsibilities. One is we regard ourselves as the architect of the Army. We don't build the Army, but we do draw up the organizational designs that we put on the battlefield. We also have the responsibility for developing Army doctrine, the intellectual foundation for what we do within the United States Army. And importantly, at least in my way of thinking, when you have a war going on, which we do, and the Department of the Army is totally consumed by trying to figure out how to resource that war, and the operational Army is totally consumed at how to fight that war, we still recognize that there's a future out there. And when the Department of the Army and the operational Army are totally concerned by current operations, somebody still has to think about that future, and that somebody is training and doctrine command. And so we say we do think a little bit. In fact, we do a lot of thinking. We think for the Army itself. And it's some of that thinking that I'm going to talk about a little bit this morning. If I could have the next slide, please. You may have heard the Chief of Staff of the Army talking about an era of persistent conflict, and let me put that into context, if I might, for you. First of all, a persistent conflict does not mean persistent war, but it does mean persistent engagement. Persistent engagement of U.S. Army soldiers, Marines, Special Operations Forces, indeed all of our military in places around the globe. And it's our judgment, based on some very compelling studies that we've done, that that era of persistent conflict is going to extend well into the depth of the 21st century. And it's driven by a number of trends that are almost irrefutable if you look at some of the studies and the science that has gone into thinking about the future of this particular century. There's this thing called globalization. I'm not exactly sure what globalization means, but I do know it has a lot to do with transparency. It has a lot to do with transparency of information, and some of that is very good. You know, transparency of information with regard to global economics is probably a good thing, but there are some negative aspects about globalization that is a fixture of the 21st century, and we ain't going back. I would submit to you that there are people in this world today who 15 or 20 years ago were disadvantaged, but they didn't know it. Today they know exactly what they don't have. They know exactly what they don't have because they see it on their cell phones, they see it on their computer screens, they see it on television every day. And frequently they're frustrated by the fact that their particular government can't provide them the same things that others have. And that is at least a source of conflict, if not one of confrontation. There are some shifting demographics that are irrefutable. There are those that say by the year 2030, 60% of the world's population will live in urban areas. And in places like Africa and the Middle East and Central Africa, there is an incredible youth bulge. That is, large populations of young people under the age of 30 that make up in excess of 50% of the populations of those areas. And if you track historically youth bulge versus conflict, you will find that virtually every place that there has been a conflict during the past 2 centuries, it is correlated very closely with a youth bulge in those areas. That suggests that if you got lots of people living in urban areas and you have a commitment for the U.S. military, chances are that the U.S. military is going to have to operate in an urban environment. In fact, our adversaries are going to force us to operate in an urban environment because it is there that they believe they can take advantage or disadvantage some of our technologies. They can take advantage of blending in with populations. And they can begin to mitigate some of the technological advances that we have come to enjoy within our military. There is certainly climate change going on in the world, and my judgment is, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, or the purpose or the reason for all that climate change, the fact of the matter is that because we have both the capacity and the capability and the compassion to deal with climatological problems around the globe, the U.S. military will probably be involved. There's numbers of failed and failing states. I would submit to you, because of the increased urbanization on our planet, there are places on our planet where there is no government control inside of urban areas. And then there's the great uncertainty about natural resources. I think it comes as no surprise to anybody in this audience that there are rising fuel costs around the globe. But there's also those that suggest that over the next several decades, shortages of water will be just as pronounced as shortages of fossil fuel. So all of those trends suggest to us, at least in Training and Doctrine Command and those of us in the Army, that the era that we are entered into, whenever it started, I'm not quite sure, but the area that we're into right now is one indeed of persistent conflicts. So what the heck does that mean? It means, in my judgment, next slide, that there is a compelling argument for the logic of land power. It seems to me that we have entered a decade, perhaps multiple decades, where our national security is inextricably linked to global security like it has never been before in our history. And we've entered into an era where global security requires not just military power, but the other elements of national power: diplomatic, informational, and economic, in order to bring some kind of reasonable end to conflict. And yet, those other elements of national power just don't show up unless there is local security provided by security organizations, be they military, be they police, be they governmental, not just American, not just U.S., but provided by the indigenous population and the indigenous governance as well. And yet local security just doesn't happen without land power. And land power, in my judgment, must be dominant in order to enable us to operate in this very complex 21st century environment. Next slide, please. And in order for that land power to be dominant, in my judgment, we have to continue to worry about and continue to push for the modernization of the U.S. military. And the essence of that modernization is embodied in the individual soldier, because you see, the essence of our modernization is designed to connect the individual soldier so that he can take advantage of a network to provide him information, to take advantage of a network to provide him reach-back capabilities that he can't carry along with him, to connect that individual with the understanding that he needs and the knowledge that he demands in order to operate in this very complex environment. In fact, there are those that have suggested that the network that we're trying to build within the U.S. military, within the U.S. Army specifically, is a pipe dream. And I just don't get it, quite frankly. I just don't get it. I don't get why in the hell I wouldn't provide an individual soldier the same kind of connectivity that a 12-year-old in high school has. The same kind of connectivity to information and knowledge that an individual has either through voice communications or text messaging or streaming video or whatever. And my judgment is that it is something that we in fact owe to the individual soldier. We also have an obligation to protect that soldier, to protect him as an individual with that which he wears, the weapon that he carries. It also has to do with protecting the individual because he is part of an organization. And there is an organizational protection that we need to be considering, because when one has good understanding of the environment in which one is operating, you can make decisions. You can make choices about whether you want to get into trouble or not. And there are pieces of the organization that provide organizational protection, which allows that soldier and that organization to provide protection to the populations that they are charged with protecting. And finally, we have an obligation to develop organizations and soldiers whose power can be projected around the globe, because you see, we don't do fair fights in the U.S. Army, nor do we do home games. And our obligation is to grow organizations that are both deployable in terms of projection and sustainable once they get there. To deter when necessary, to fight when necessary, to engage with our international partners in order to enhance this global security environment that we find ourselves in. So that's a little bit about what TRADOC does, a little bit about the operational environment, and a little bit about what I believe to be the essence of Army modernization. Let me now talk a little bit about science and technology and where that all fits, where we are going. If I could have the next slide, please. We in the United States Army, at least those of us in TRADOC that are thinking about it, are trying to drive Army investment in areas that have a potential to have a profound impact on our future capabilities in the next 10 or 15 years. We're trying to sufficiently shape that science and technology investment and coordinate cross-domain requirements to realize capability outcomes. And I'm going to talk specifically about 5 of those outcomes that we are looking to achieve over the next 10 to 15 years. Battle command, countering the IED network, power and energy, and 2 areas of my own personal concern about the human dimension in training. So if I could have the next slide, please. We talk about networks as if they were some kind of abstract thing, and they are. But I think it's important for all of us to understand the only purpose of the network is to provide information to commanders and small unit leaders so they can make decisions. And that network, in my judgment, needs to be beyond line of sight. It needs to integrate both the command, that is the art, that which we teach soldiers how to command and lead formations in combat, but also the science, the technology, to provide that information so those decisions can be made. That network needs to be, in my judgment, optimized for mobile operations. Aside from the fact that most of our command posts in Iraq and Afghanistan today are in fixed sites, the requirement remains for conducting large-scale mobile operations sometime in the future, in my judgment. And we can't hook ourselves to fixed site command posts that have generally unlimited bandwidth, generally assured access to bandwidth, generally assured power and energy, and relatively secure capability, because one of these days we may just have to pick up and move those command posts and go do something. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we have an obligation, in my judgment, to give the access to the individual soldier the same kind of information that over time their commanders have grown to appreciate and use. Next slide. Because you see, commanders command from any place within their area of operations. They can't be tied to a single location because they themselves have to be out and amongst the soldiers. They have to be out and amongst the soldiers, learning what soldiers know, dialoguing with soldiers, and sometimes sharing the dangers that their soldiers are encountering. Because you see, the science of the network really enables the art of command. And it has to be focused on action, not processes. And we talk at times about things like the transportation layer and the application and the services and the standards and the transport layer and all that sort of stuff. And all of that makes great sense from a technological perspective, but the purpose of it all is to provide that commander the information he needs in order to make decisions. And it's an important component of that which we're looking for from a science and technological perspective early in the 21st century. Next slide. It would seem that the weapon of choice, at least in this juncture in our history, is the IED. Explosives applied to prevent our freedom of action, our freedom of maneuver, and in many cases, to apply sheer terror to the population that we're charged with protecting. We need to develop technologies that can identify and neutralize these kinds of obstacles at distance, so we don't put our soldiers or the population at risk. We need to develop technologies that determine the threat, that select the best method of neutralization and ascertain possible effects before those effects are realized on the battlefield. And finally, perhaps most importantly, is encountering those IEDs, encountering those mines, encountering those explosives gives our formations freedom of action on the battlefield so that we can continue on with our mission and not be slaved to the reduction of a particular IED or group of mines and associated capabilities. Next slide. We understand that there's a persistent and adaptive enemy out there, and he's going to counter whatever technology we provide with new ways of doing business. I ran into an EOD specialist, a explosive demolition specialist in Iraq not too long ago, who had kind of done a self-study of IEDs, and his judgment was the patterns that we were seeing in Iraq were exactly the same patterns and in exactly the same sequence as that which was experienced by the British forces in Northern Ireland. Wouldn't it be useful if we were able to do that kind of analysis? Wouldn't it be useful to try to figure out what the next capability was that we haven't quite yet seen yet, but is perfectly capable of being introduced on the battlefield? And wouldn't it be useful when we do counter a particular capability on the part of the enemy that we continue to look backwards to see if he is going to use more or less technologically advanced initiating devices, for example, because we have countered those that have become more technologically advanced? We understand full well that any single approach is going to be quickly countered. And so we have to have multiple approaches, hopefully multiple approaches against capabilities that we have not yet seen on the battlefield, but are perfectly capable of being there if introduced by a resilient and resourceful enemy. And we recognize the approach to IEDs has to be a holistic one, providing persistent, that is, continuous intelligence and surveillance of the battlefield to make sure that we understand what we're getting into in real time, to protect the soldiers, to detect the capabilities that I just mentioned a minute ago, and importantly, to neutralize those capabilities so that we can continue on with our operations. I would also suggest to you that I personally am not absolutely convinced we have figured out what sensors we need in order to do the kind of detection that is necessary on this battlefield. We as soldiers seem to have fallen in love with streaming video provided from a UAV. But having sat behind a flat panel display staring at that streaming video on occasion, I can tell you that you can't tell an individual's intent by just looking at them walking down the street. In fact, an individual wearing blue jeans and a polo shirt and carrying an AK-47 could be a good guy or a bad guy, or somebody who hadn't decided whether they want to be good or bad yet. And you don't get that kind of intent, you don't get that kind of depth of understanding purely from streaming video. I would suggest to you that there are probably sensors that we haven't even developed yet that can begin to look at the root cause and the root capability that is part of IEDs and mines and begin to get at the network and the supply chain that provides the supplies to that network before the IED or the mine is actually in place. And it's extraordinarily important, in my judgment, to have standoff reduction capability so we can maintain our momentum. Because our purpose in life is not to neutralize IEDs. Our purpose in life is to have freedom of action on the battlefield so we can provide security to that battlefield, security to our own formations, and security to the populations that we are charged to protect. IEDs, as I suggest, in the front end of the 21st century has become the weapon of choice by our adversaries, and it's something that demands our continued attention. Next slide. Power and energy is a big deal. Every new technology we put on the battlefield requires additional power, additional energy, and yet we don't have unlimited supplies. We have the requirement, because of our requirement to project our capabilities worldwide, to reduce the weight and volume of the fuel, and fuel alone, because in order to provide fuel to our formations, we have to put a convoy on the road. In order to put the convoy on the road, we have to put soldiers at risk. And for every truck that we don't put on the road, that's risk avoided. And so looking at the volume and weight of fuel is a big deal from a military capabilities perspective, and it's also a big deal because it allows us to sustain our formations for extended periods of time once deployed. We fully appreciate that going hand in hand with reduced fuel capacity is the fuel economy requirement. And in the era of persistent conflict that I described earlier, where soldiers are operating in an urban environment and are operating dismounted, and we continue to provide them new technologies, we also give them the burden of having to carry the energy for those new technologies on their back. We indeed need to radically increase the available power and radically reduce the tactical weight of those batteries, of those fuel sources for the individual soldier. Next slide. Just to give you some idea of how much fuel we're consuming, we're talking about a brigade, somewhere between 16 and 30,000 gallons per day. And that's a hell of a lot of trucks. More importantly, we're talking about soldiers whose requirement for battery power is going up considerably, and yet we haven't made our soldiers any stronger or any more capable to carry all that crap. In an era of persistent conflict where we intend to have brigade combat teams and our formations widely distributed across the battlefield, the autonomy of those brigades, the autonomy of those formations needs to be measured in days rather than hours, and I would suggest to you 72 hours is about the minimum that we're looking for autonomous operation of a brigade combat team. And we cannot achieve that today, largely because of the fuel and energy requirements associated with that brigade combat team. And as I suggested earlier, the MSR, the main supply route, tends to become, in that environment, our Achilles heel. And our enemies know it. Anything that we can do to reduce the power and energy consumption of our formations, both all the way from the individual soldier to the platform that he rides on to the overall consumption of his organization, is time and energy and money well invested. Let me talk for a moment about the human dimension, if I could. Next slide. My personal bias is that this is an area that has been underdeveloped over the last several years. We tend to concentrate on gizmos and not on the individual that uses them. And yet we find ourselves in an era where operating in and among the people, operating in the very complex environment of an urban setting, requires extraordinary physical and cognitive performance on the part of our soldiers. Because by virtue of operating in those environments, our soldiers become part of the social network that is comprised not only of soldiers, but the people who live in that environment. And our soldiers need to be better capable, better qualified, better trained in order to operate in that environment. I'm absolutely convinced that we can improve the mental, moral, and physical capacity and performance of our soldiers by doing things differently that we have in the past. Wouldn't it be useful, I would submit to you, to precondition a soldier before he gets placed in a very traumatic, very intense urban environment, to precondition him for what to expect in that environment so he can deal with it a little bit more effectively and perhaps more efficiently, and importantly, when he comes out of that environment, be better prepared for the trauma that he has experienced to bring him back to reality and reintegrate with our society. And wouldn't it be useful to take a young man who's about to take command of a battalion, a brigade, or division and give him a synthetic look at what he is going to have to do, what decisions he's got to make, the complexity of the environment that he's going to operate in, so that Rolodex in his head, that Rolodex of experiences, is developed before he takes command as opposed to when he takes command. Wouldn't it be interesting, perhaps even useful, to take a young commander and put him in an environment where he gets multiple replications of being a commander without having to actually command soldiers in combat? So he develops the decision-making capability and the cognitive skills associated with being in command of soldiers in a very dynamic and very complex environment before he ever has to experience it. And I'm absolutely convinced that somewhere, someplace, somehow, that we can develop the capabilities to do exactly that. I would also suggest to you that perhaps, just perhaps, we don't know how to recruit the right soldier. Because you see, when we recruit a soldier today, the measure of goodness of a soldier is, does he have a high school education and does he pass the Armed Forces battery of tests? Now, I don't have to tell you that all high school educations are not created equal. There are those that graduate from private high schools that are very, very intelligent, very well qualified, and there are the others that go to some inner city high school where their capabilities and their knowledge is not as well honed or well developed or well tested as others. And yet we regard a high school education as a measure of merit, a measure of intellect, if you will. And then we have this thing called the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test, which does exactly that. It measures the aptitude of the individual to be a mechanic or a clerk. But it doesn't measure at all their motivation to be a soldier. And it seems to me if we could figure out the motivation and the aptitude and the intellect, then we could go after the right individual to be a soldier in the United States Army. Indeed, a Marine in the U.S. Marine Corps, a Special Operations soldier, or any other service. Because you see, I'm absolutely convinced when you look at the population of young people across the United States, by our measure, only 3 in 10 is fully qualified to be a soldier in the United States Army. And I got to ask myself, why is that number not 4 in 10, or 5 in 10, or 6 in 10? And is 3 in 10 because of the metrics we use or the lack of qualification of our youth? And my judgment is it's probably a combination of the both. Anyway, I do believe we have some work to do in the human dimension. Next slide. I do believe it's an imperative for the 21st century because, you see, our adversaries are going to try to counter our ability to dominate in the land domain. We're going to be dealing with non-state actors. We're going to be dealing with adversaries that avoid force-on-force conflict because they know they can't win it. We're going to be dealing with adversaries that apply asymmetric means that we don't even understand are means to defeat us. They're going to hide in urban clutter. They're going to hide in complex terrain. They're going to be used the very population in which they operate as a shield and to provide them information. And it is my judgment that capabilities in the human dimension are the only way we're going to ensure our dominance in the 21st century in the environment in which we're going to have to operate. Now, I got to admit to you, that's not the environment I would prefer to operate in. As a soldier, I would like to operate in wide open spaces, uncluttered by urban environment, uncluttered and uncomplicated by population, but that is not the operational environment that we're going to see in the 21st century. It's just not going to happen. And we've got to prepare ourselves for the certainty of having to operate in that environment, and my judgment is investigation of the human dimension will help us do exactly that. Finally, let me talk just for a moment about training. Next slide. If you'd asked me 10 years ago whether this live virtual constructive stuff was going to work, I would have told you no. I have changed my mind. I have seen advances in simulation technologies. I've seen advances in gaming technologies. I've seen advances in social networking which suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, we can create synthetic environments for the training of the individual soldier in a very complex environment which we cannot replicate in our training centers and schools because of the cost associated therewith. And there's a compelling argument I would suggest to you for developing capabilities that allow us to train new equipment before a soldier ever sees it. So that when he first sees a new piece of equipment, he has already done the crawl and walk phase of understanding the capabilities of that equipment. There's a compelling argument I would suggest for training before fielding, which enhances the capability of the individual soldier to operate the equipment, certainly, but it also shortens the training time, potentially, and gives us a better trained soldier on that piece of equipment in a shorter period of time. It seems to me we need to account for the individual's proficiency. As you see, I run all the U.S. Army centers and schools around the United States. And our 20th century paradigm has been when a soldier arrives at training on day 1, he graduates on day 37, and he goes through a very rote step sequence of training in order to achieve the proficiencies and the capabilities that we want him to have. And it takes us 37 days to do that. I'm absolutely convinced that some soldier has achieved all of the proficiency and all of the capabilities that we want him to have well in advance of those 37 days. Wouldn't it be useful as an institution to allow soldiers to learn at their pace as opposed to the pace of the institution? The challenge, of course, is how do you measure the proficiency of the soldier in that kind of, I would suggest, somewhat chaotic from an institutional perspective environment. And that training has to be absolutely scalable and adaptable to all types of environments. Because you see, we're concentrated on counterinsurgency operations, we're concentrated on Iraq and Afghanistan today, but who's to say in 10 years from now it won't be on some other part of the planet, immersed in some other culture, immersed in some other culture that speaks a language other than Farsi or Pashto or Arabic. And we need to be preparing soldiers today and leaders today to operate in that 10-year from now environment that we can't even figure out what it's going to be. And therefore, we have to have available to us adaptable and scalable training systems that allow us to do exactly that. Next slide. So in my judgment, it's really two questions. What should we train? Centered on the individual soldier, and not to overlook the values and the ethics that that individual soldier must have. And therefore, and then how to train them. And what mix of live and virtual and constructive training is acceptable and provides the best product. How can we enhance the realism of that virtual environment to expose the individual to things we can't expose them to in a live environment, so that when they do enter into the real world live environment, that urban clutter, that complexity, that population, that they are not only capable of operating in that environment, but they thrive in that environment. We in Training and Doctrine Command are running some experiments right now with social networking. Over the next 30 to 45 days, you might, if you're one of them Second Life avatar dudes that likes to go populate islands within Second Life, you will find an Army island in Second Life, largely focused on U.S. Army recruiting, introducing people to what it is to be a soldier and giving them some virtual experiences like jumping out of airplanes and rappelling off of towers and using a weapon, to see if we can get some kind of recruiting benefit out of this social networking. But we're not just stopping there. We're also looking at the potential of bringing together classrooms at the Command and Staff College, classrooms at our Sergeant's Major Academy, and classrooms at the United States Army War College in a virtual sense, so that they're studying one single subject from 3 different locations with one instructor through the use of some of these social networking technologies. And it's not widely understood that when a young man signs a contract to be a soldier, frequently they go into our delayed entry program. They sign a contract and maybe they're going to enter the United States Army 8 months later, because we want them to get that high school diploma before they join the Army. And our experience over time is that when a soldier signs up and signs that contract on that delayed entry program, we lose about 18% of those that contract to be a soldier, because things change. They fall in love, they don't graduate, they get in trouble with the law. So we're running an experiment to see if an individual, when he signs a contract, is issued an avatar, and he now connects with his drill sergeant in a virtual sense on a routine basis. Can that reduce the amount of future soldier attrition? Can we enhance the individual's performance in a virtual sense, so when he does enter basic training, he enters at a much higher level or a little bit higher level, but most importantly, he becomes part of the Army team before he ever really joins the Army team through a virtual connectivity, through one of these social networking capabilities and technologies. Now, I'm not sure how far all this stuff can take us, but I'm absolutely convinced we ought to figure it out, because I'm absolutely convinced there's some potential there. I'm also absolutely convinced that some of the capability that reside in things like Active World and Second Life are oversold. But I'm not willing to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I am willing to experiment and see what advantages we can take from all of that. Next slide. So in summary, and let me just give you 3 points. First of all, we're all about empowering soldiers to dominate in the land domain, because that is the domain in which we are going to operate in the 21st century, like it or not. Because it indeed is the land domain where people live. And you can't deal with people in a real sense from 20,000 leagues below the sea or 30,000 feet above. Because if you're going to deal with the intricacies of population and the desires of the population and the futures of the population, you got to deal with the population directly. And that's what our soldiers are doing every day in Iraq and Afghanistan. And my judgment is we've got to better prepare them for that environment. Secondly, from the perspective of the Training and Doctrine Command commander, I'm not interested in science and technology for science and technology's sake. I'm interested in science and technology for the outcome that they can produce. Better trained soldiers, more intuitive leaders, better fuel economy, lower weight of the individual soldier, better network connectivity at lower prices, and the like. And finally, I would submit to you, because of the environment that we operate in, because of this era of persistent conflict, that science and technology applied to training in the human dimension will dramatically increase the performance of the individual American soldier. Thanks, Dr. Killian, for the opportunity to talk with this body today, and thanks to each of you. Your very presence shows that you have interest in what we are talking about. Your very presence suggests that you have interest in making the capabilities of the American soldier, and indeed the soldiers of our allied and partner nations, better than what they are today. And we very much appreciate not only your attendance, but your continued support of the U.S. military. Thank you very much.